good morning and thank you for joining us. We are here today to talk about E-2 visa options where the investment amount is low or kind of riskier E-2 cases. A few things before we get started. Some of you may know that Scott Legal was founded on an E-2 visa several years ago. Our founder, Ian Scott, personally has an E-2 visa and has also renewed the visa. And we are happy to share those experiences with you. Scott Legal is also a full service immigration firm, but primarily focuses on E-2 visas. We process hundreds of them, and we process E-2 visas typically that are higher risk, meaning lower investment amounts. We process at consulates around the world, but the primary two consulates we process at are Toronto in Canada and London in the UK. We will continue our webinar series. Doing at least 2 webinars a month and often more on different immigration law topics. And at the end of this webinar, we'll send out a few things. One is the PowerPoint that you see here today. Another is an E-2 visa guide, which is a comprehensive guide going over all the requirements for the E-2 visa. And then also a link where you can sign up for additional webinars. In terms of our panelists today, we're very lucky to have Michaela Romesser, who is a senior associate at Scott Legal and has vast experience processing E-2 visas. My name is Kelly Weiner, and I'm a partner at Scott Legal, and I'll be sharing more towards the end of the presentation. If you have questions during the presentation, please send them through the chat box. Excuse me, and we will, reserve time at the end for questions. And finally, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on our YouTube channel and on demand for you to view. Without further delay, I'll turn it over to Michaela so we can start talking about the E-2 visa requirements.
Thank you so much, Kelly, and good morning, everyone. Let's start and go over the E-2 visa requirements. The first requirement is that you must be a national of an E-2 visa treaty country. The important thing to keep in mind here is that, what matters is your nationality and not the country of birth. Let's say that you were born in a country that is not an E-2 visa treaty country, like, for example, China or India, but later in your life, you acquired citizenship of an E-2 visa treaty country. You could still apply for an E-2 visa under the treaty country nationality. What you will have to show is just evidence that you have a passport of an E-2 visa treaty country. Regarding what countries are E-2 visa treaty countries, so many countries all over the world are E-2 visa treaty countries. So, for example, many countries in Europe, Africa, Asia, such as, UK, Italy, Japan, Canada, and many others are E-2 visa treaty countries. You would just need to, double check if your country, is an E-2 visa treaty country. The second requirement is that you must own at least 50% in the E-2 company. To qualify for an E-2 visa, you would have to set up an entity in the US. That's a requirement. And then you would have to own at least 50% in that entity. And this requirement has to be met at the time you are applying for an E-2 visa, but also, you would always have to keep that ownership. You would always have to own at least 50%, as that's one of the requirements. And you could either kind of like set up an entity in the US, or if you want to purchase a business, that's fine as well. And then you would have to own at least 50% in the company you are purchasing. So then the next requirement is that you must make an investment in the US. And here, what's important is that the funds you are investing must be at risk. And so what this means is that, the money has to be actually spent before the E-2 visa is issued to you. And so, like, let's say that you transfer like $100,000 and it's just kind of like sitting on the E-2 company's bank account, and you are saying to the officer that, like once you get the E-2 visa, you are going to spend that money. That would not work for the E-2 visa, as one of the requirements is that the money must be at risk. And this means that, like all the money has to be spent before the E-2 visa is actually issued to you. At the time you are applying for an E-2 visa, you will have to show that, the money you are investing comes from a legitimate source. So here, for, like if we are filing the petition at a consulate, the consulates usually, just kind of like want to see simple documentation, just kind of, describing what's the source of funds. So let's say, for example, that the money comes from your savings from employment, at a consulate, generally we could just submit your tax return and then evidence that you transferred the money, from your personal account to the company's account. In case you want to apply with the USCIS, the documents you would have to submit the documentation would be kind of much more extensive, because USCIS kind of focuses on this requirement much more than the consulates. And generally you would have to submit documents showing that, like if you are saying that the money comes from earnings or savings from your salary, you would need to submit all of your bank statements showing that you were receiving the salary from your employer, and then this money accumulated on your bank account, and then you transfer this money to the E-2 company's account. So that's just kind of like one thing to keep in mind, when deciding like where you want to apply, because as I mentioned, consulates generally don't focus on this requirement that much. They just like want to see that the money comes from a legitimate source and want to see just kind of brief documentation about that. The investment you are making, in the E-2 business must be substantial, and we'll discuss this in more detail on the next slide. And so what can you include as part of your E-2 investment? So let's discuss this requirement, like when you are starting a business and then when you are purchasing a business. So when you are starting a company in the US, generally you can include like anything you need to get the company up and running. You can include that as part of your E-2 visa investment. So like, let's say that you are starting a company and you are going to sell, some goods to clients. So then like any inventory you purchase, like that can be included as part of your E-2 investment. Any money you spend for like website setup, marketing, all of that can be included. Money you spend to set up the E-2, the business entity, that can be included. Legal fees can be included. Any money you pay for like rent, like warehouse space or office space, all of that can be included. Let's say that you prepay the rent for 12 months. You can include all of that as part of your E-2 investment. If you need to purchase, like furniture or office supplies, all of that can be included as part of the E-2 investment. So generally, like any expenditures, that are kind of related and they're, to set up of the E-2 entity, all of that can be included. And we'll go over, in a little bit more detail about like what are some good versus bad E-2 visa expenditures later in the presentation. Let's say that you are purchasing, like let's say that you find a business in the US, you like that business and you are going to purchase it from the seller. Then the E-2 investment, the E-2 investment would be the money you pay, you pay to the seller, so the purchase price for the business. And one thing I wanted to mention, when deciding, whether you want to purchase a business in the US, so you can either purchase it and just kind of pay the money to the seller, or there is also an option to kind of transfer the purchase price and to an escrow. And then, like once the E-2 visa is approved, then the escrow agent would transfer the money to the seller. And, the advantage, or what many people kind of like about this setup, is that, they sign basically an agreement with the escrow agent. All of the contingencies have to be satisfied, and the only contingency left can be the approval of the E-2 visa. But how this basically works is that, like you would sign the purchase sale agreement, you would sign an escrow agreement, and then let's say that, if the E-2 visa is approved, then the money is transferred from the escrow to the seller. But let's say that if for any reason the E-2 visa is not approved, you will get the money back from the escrow agent. So that's why, like when purchasing a business, many people prefer to kind of go through the escrow arrangement, because just in any case that the E-2 visa is not approved, they'll still get their money back. So the next E-2 visa requirement is that the E-2 business cannot be marginal. And so this basically means that, the E-2 company must have either a present or a future capacity to kind of support more than just your family, yourself and your family. And this basically means that the E-2 company, must be able to hire hire and pay US employees. So, it's not required that you already have kind of employees, working for the E-2 company at the time you are applying for the E-2 visa. If you do, that's a great advantage, and it strengthens the application a lot, but it's not a requirement. So if you don't have employees at the time you're applying for the E-2 visa, then you would need to submit a business plan. So that would be the case, in most cases when you are kind of abroad, you are starting a company in the US, you wouldn't necessarily have employees yet. So in that case, you would submit a business plan with your application. And in that business plan, you should kind of outline your hiring projections for the next 5 years. Generally, we recommend that you plan to hire at least 3 full-time employees in the next 5 years. So if you don't have employees at the time you're applying for an E-2 visa, you would basically meet the marginality requirements through submission of the business plan. You should be able to kind of explain the kind of how the company is going to make revenue and how it will be able to pay all these employees you plan to hire in the next 5 years. The next requirement is that the E-2 business must be real and operating. So let's say that you are purchasing an existing business in the US, and the company is already kind of running and operating, is already taking revenue, has clients. So again, this will be, that will definitely be helpful for the application, and you would be submitting for the real and operating requirement. You would be submitting evidence such as, bank statements showing that the company is taking, receiving payments from clients, the company's profit and loss statement, balance sheet, any contracts, if applicable, with clients, invoices you are issuing to clients, and things like that. Let's say that the company is not yet taking revenue from clients, and that would be, again, kind of the case in most applications when kind of you are currently residing outside the US, you are starting the company in the US, but you don't have any employees yet, and you kind of need the E-2 visa to enter to the US and kind of get the get the company kind of up and running. So in that case, you would be submitting evidence such as, signed commercial lease to kind of show that, even though the company is not yet taking revenue, it has an office space, it has warehouse space, if applicable, and is kind of ready. And the only thing kind of missing is kind of, you coming to the US and, starting the operations. Another thing you could submit is evidence that the company has all the licenses it needs to kind of start operations, evidence that you created website, letters of intent if you are able to get some, or contracts with clients. So, in this case, if the company is not taking revenue yet, you would be submitting evidence showing basically that everything is ready, and really kind of like the only thing missing is you getting the E-2 visa. And once you get the E-2 visa, you will come to the US and the company will kind of, like start selling goods or providing services immediately. The next requirement is that you as the E-2 investor will solely develop and direct the E-2 business. So this basically means that you must have some sort of managerial or executive role in the E-2 company. If you're applying for an E-2 investor visa, the plan should be to kind of run the operations of the company. To kind of like meet this requirement, you would generally need to submit your resume, educational degrees, and just kind of like description of the job duties you will perform for the E-2 company. Sometimes we get a question, many people ask, like, oh, this is my first company. I never kind of like operate a company before, like, is that okay? So the answer is yes. We have had many cases, and I would say, most of the cases where people are kind of like employed, like outside the US, and then they decide to either like purchase a company or start a company in the US. They don't have any necessary like entrepreneurial like background, and that's completely okay. If you do have that background, that would be really helpful, but it's not required. And then the last requirement is that you must have intent to return to your home country when the E-2 visa expires. And so for this requirement, what is generally required is just your signed declaration that says that once the E-2 visa expires, you plan to return to your home country. For the E-2 visa, the government doesn't usually ask for like evidence of your ties to your home country, like as they would, for example, when you would be applying for a B visa. So generally that signed declaration is kind of like all they want to see. Perfect. So now let's move on and let's discuss, like who can apply and how long can the E-2 visa be issued for. So as I said, nationals of E-2 treaty countries can apply for an E-2 visa. So if you're a national of one of those countries, you can apply. So there are two options, as I kind of already briefly discussed on the first slide, to kind of obtain the E-2 visa. One is through purchase of already existing business in the US. And the second one is through starting your own company in the US. And so now let's discuss, like how long can the E-2 visa be issued for? So this will basically depend on your country of nationality. So, this is called kind of like reciprocity period. So each country has its kind of like own reciprocity period. This is the period for which the E-2 visa can be approved for. So, like nationals of many countries can get the E-2 visa for up to 5 years. So, this would mean that if the consulate approves your application, they would issue the visa for 5 years. But there are some countries, that have shorter reciprocity periods. So, for example, nationals of Jordan can only get the E-2 visa for 3 months. So, again, you would just kind of like need to check the period for your particular country. And I also wanted to kind of like briefly discuss kind of like the period for which the visa is issued versus the period you can stay in the US on an E-2 status. So basically, every time you enter the US on the E-2 visa status, you can stay in the US for a period of up to 2 years. And so let's say that even though you have visa issued for 5 years, when you come to the US, you will only be able to stay for 2 years, and then you will need to leave the US and re-enter, and then you would be basically granted another, 2 years of stay. And, even nationals of countries such, Jordan, that can get the E-2 visa only for 3 months, even when they enter, they would be able to stay for up to 2 years. So that's kind of the difference between the, the visa validity versus the period of stay they can stay in the US. We always recommend that, like E2 visa investors or like basically anyone who comes to the US on any sort of visa checks their I-94 on the CBP website. Because you should be, every time you enter on the E2 visa, you should be granted 2 years. But sometimes the CBP makes, mistakes. They give you kind of like different period of stay. So we generally recommend that every time you come to the US, you go on the CBP I-94 website and you just kind of like double check that you were granted the 2 years, and you just keep the expiration date in mind and leave the US before your I-94 expires. Perfect. So the next, or kind of like the requirement I wanted to discuss in more detail is the substantiality requirement. So we said that you must make a substantial investment in the, in the US. And so what does this mean? So there is no kind of like minimum set amount in the regulations. There is no like definition what is substantial. Unfortunately, like there is no like no regulation that says like if you invest over $100,000 in the US, you'll be approved. But the substantiality requirement basically means, it will depend on a business you are starting or purchasing, but it basically means that, you must invest all the money that is necessary to get that particular business you are starting up and running. So, and what the government kind of like uses to determine, like whether your E2 investment is substantial is so-called proportionality test. So if you are starting a business in the US, the government will basically look at, like how much money you invested in the business. And then they kind of like look at what are the usual costs associated with establishing that type of business. So, you can submit to kind of like meet this requirement. You can submit evidence such as, for example, letter from CPA, just kind of concluding that, you invested everything that was needed to get this particular business up and running. Or, you could also submit business articles, if you can find business articles that say, that for your particular business, this is the usual amount, and then you invested at least that amount or higher. You could submit that with the application. In case you are purchasing an already existing business in the US, then the government will basically look at the purchase price you paid for the business, and then the fair market value of the business, and just kind of compare those two. And if they are kind of the same or similar, then they would make that determination. Perfect. So what are some strategies, how to deal with a low dollar investment amount? So, let's say, so as a general rule, kind of like the absolute minimum amount, like we would, and again, like this would kind of depend on a business you want to start in the US, but generally kind of like the absolute minimum we would recommend would be around $40,000 to $50,000 spent, and then kind of having some additional money on the company's bank account as working capital. But again, this is kind of a general rule, and for some businesses, that would be too low, and you would have to spend much more money than that. But let's say that your investment amount is kind of like on the lower side, and like you already purchased like everything what was required, and there is like nothing else that makes sense for you to kind of like invest in. So what can you do to kind of like make the E2 application stronger? So in this case, definitely, like if you have signed contracts with clients, that would be definitely helpful for the application, because it just kind of shows interest of people in, like your particular, goods or services. If you cannot get kind of signed contracts, letters of intent are also very helpful. You could also get letters from local organizations, such as, your local chamber of commerce. They would just kind of outline and explain, like why your business, like would be helpful in that particular community. One other thing that would definitely help if your investment amount is on the lower side is a strong business plan, or if you are able to hire employees before your interview, that would be extremely helpful for the application. So in that case, we would submit evidence such as employment agreement with the employee, or payroll payments to the employee to show that you are already paying the employee. So now let's look at these two examples. So example one is you are opening a business in the US and the investment amount is low, but you already hired 2 US employees and the business already started taking revenue around $80,000 per month, and you already have some clients in the US. So I would say in this case, even though, like, let's say the investment amount is around like $45,000, it looks like a very strong case, just in sense that, you already have clients, the company is already taking revenues, the company already has employees. So in this case, the case, would still, has a very high chance to be approved, even though the investment amount is on the lower side. On the other hand, in example 2, you are applying for an E-2 visa and the investment amount is low, but you don't want to invest any more money and you don't want to hire anyone until after your E-2 visa is approved. And let's say you have no contracts or no letters of intent. So, in this case, the case can still be approved, but it's just kind of like much weaker case than, in the first example. So kind of like the general advice is that if your E-2 investment amount is very low, you would want to make the other kind of aspects of the E-2 application strong. So definitely, if you are able to hire employees, if the company can start operating while you are still outside the US and start taking revenue, that will be definitely helpful for the application. Perfect. So now let's go over some common E-2 visa expenditures. So, like what expenditures you can include in your E-2 visa application. So basically, any money you pay for website setup and hosting, you can include that. Any sort of, like computer equipment, such, like computer, phones, scanners, printers, like anything you will need to kind of like, to be able to run the business, you can include that. If you will be selling, some goods to clients, you can definitely include all the money, you paid for the inventory. One thing to mention here is that the inventory doesn't have to be purchased in the US. It can be shipped from outside the US. If you need any furniture to set up your office, you could include that. You can also include any money you pay for trademark or, intellectual property purchase. If you, as mentioned, if you already have employees, or independent contractors, and they are, the independent contractors are providing, some services, you can include all the money you paid to the employees or independent contractors. You can also include the money you paid for legal fees. So, the business entity setup fees, or, anything you paid to like a business attorney to set up the entity, or the immigration fees or business plan fees, you can include all of that. As mentioned, you can include any money you kind of like prepaid for the lease. So sometimes, like when the E-2 investment amount is on the lower side, what helps is to kind of prepay the rent for, let's say, 6 or 12 months, and that usually increases the investment amount, as you can include all of that in the investment schedule. You can include any kind of like office supplies you need to, set up the office, any kind of like licensing fees. So, any kind of like city or state fees you need to pay. If one question we often get is, can I include, I purchased a car or a truck, can I include that as part of my investment? So the general rule is that, this can be only included if, the car is kind of like absolutely necessary for you to kind of like operate the business. So like, let's say that you are starting like a food delivery company or transportation company, in that case, we can definitely include that. Also, like let's say that you are starting like a construction company and you kind of like need to transport the equipment and supplies and stuff like that. In those type of cases, we can include the money you paid for the truck. But the car or truck you purchased, it should definitely be purchased like in the E-2 company's name, and it should be licensed as commercial vehicle. If it's in your personal name, it may not be like that helpful for the E-2 application. So when you are kind of deciding, it should definitely be purchased in the company's name, not your personal name. And then any money you pay for, like software, subscriptions, or advertising, marketing, all of that can be included as part of the E-2 visa investment. So all of these were, kind of good or strong E-2 visa expenditures. So now let's just briefly mention some weaker expenditures we generally don't recommend to include, because the consulates or USCIS kind of often push back on these type of expenditures, and they they argue that these are just kind of not that relevant to you starting or necessary to you starting the business in the US. So we generally don't include, like travel flights, plane, money you paid for plane tickets, or taxis, hotels. So all of those we would not include. Then any money you pay for, like let's say that you are living outside the US and you are kind of like you entered the US a couple times on a B1 visa, and you were kind of investigating E-2 visa investment opportunities, and you paid for a hotel and you want to include those hotels. Again, those expenditures would be kind of weak expenditures, and we generally would not include them. As I mentioned, any money you paid for transportation, meals, entertainment, we wouldn't include those. And also, any kind of expenses you paid to related parties, we generally wouldn't recommend to include those as part of the E-2 visa investment. Perfect. And now Kelly will talk about what are some common challenges and tips for consulting businesses.
Thank you, Michaela. Perfect. So I think, one of the things that we hear really commonly is that someone will come and say, well, I want to start up a consulting business, but I don't need to spend any money. So how could I, qualify for the E-2 visa? Because I have my knowledge, I have my contacts in the industry, I have a computer already, I don't need anything else. So ultimately, the issue here, right, is as an entrepreneur, very often what you want to do in your first year is spend as little money as possible. However, for the visa, it is an investor visa and you do need to spend money. So ultimately, you have to think about how can you, spend enough money to demonstrate you are committed to successfully operating the enterprise. Investing, $2,000 is really not going to convince an officer, even if you can argue to them, well, I don't need anything else. What they need to see is that, there's enough investment funds at risk and irrevocably committed that it is very likely that if they issue you a 5-year visa, you're going to come into the US and follow through on your business plan. So even though hypothetically you could start a consulting business with very little money, you do need to invest the money in order to get the visa. So we often recommend try to think about, in your first and second year of operations, what would you have to spend money on? And perhaps, are there any things you can prepay, to bolster the investment amount while also spending money on things that are important or necessary for your business? So for example, commercial office space, although it's not needed by many businesses, it is recommended, and it's not required for the E-2, but it does strengthen the case to have commercial office space. I think helps set the impression for the officer. that you intend to do business in the United States. Equipment as well. So let's say that, in your first couple of years, you're going to hire 2 to 3 employees. Perhaps you would wait until you hired them in order to, purchase equipment for them, printers and computers and scanners and things like that. But perhaps you make those expenditures now, because it helps your investment amount. Similarly, you can invest in kind of a more robust marketing plan than perhaps you would have. So let's say you have a very basic website and you plan to do an upgrade eventually. Perhaps you pay a little bit more to have, a more extensive website up front. Additionally, you can hire employees. Those are always, good expenditures. You cannot, hire an employee and then count their entire yearly salary. But if you hire them and perhaps they're doing some setup activities for you or fielding initial client questions, anything you pay them at the time that you file the case, you can include in your investment amount. Similarly, any kind of ancillary expenses related to employees, such as setting up a payroll provider or insurance, those things are also really great E2 expenditures. So that's something that you could do to help get the investment amount higher, even though hypothetically you wouldn't need to spend that much to start your consulting company. All right, let's talk about some E2 visa challenges for real estate. So real estate investments, the trick here is that consulates are very sensitive to the idea that people may want to just purchase a single property or a couple properties, perhaps put that into the name of an LLC and say, this is my investment. I've made, so that is unfortunately not going to qualify for an E2 visa. And in fact, on many consulate websites, it's even in the FAQs where they will say, purchasing a property does not qualify you for the E2 visa. So when you're doing a real estate, company, you already know the officer is going to be looking at the case, with more scrutiny, because they want to really make sure that this is not just an idle speculative investment, but that there's actually a real and operating business that's providing a service or a good and receiving revenue in return, that it's going to support hiring employees in the U.S. So all of that is very important for a real estate company. So some ideas from clients we've had in the past, a real estate brokerage firm, a real estate property management company, where perhaps you're going to manage multiple properties. If this is just, well, I own a couple properties and I put them on Airbnb, I think that is very risky. That's, I think, not really going to rise to the level of, real and operating the way that they want for an E2 visa. But let's say you're going to have a property management company and you're going to manage your own properties and lots of other properties, or let's say you have an apartment building, with dozens and dozens or hundreds of units. That may be a different scenario. Real estate renovation, construction, those can be, good E2 opportunities, and house flipping as well, but only on a very large scale. So for example, we had a client who was doing house flipping for about a portfolio of 30 to 40 homes. That type of large real estate development can qualify for the E2 visa. But if it's just that you purchased one home and you're, flipping that one home, that often is not going to work. Maybe viewed as kind of not, not a real and operating business, but just kind of a passive real estate investment. All right, so let's talk about another risky area. So E2 visas for equity trading companies. So kind of, I'd say very similar risks to real estate. So placing your stock portfolio in the name of an LLC is not going to qualify. Saying you're going to manage assets for yourself and, maybe your family or maybe a friend or two, that also generally is going to be kind of difficult to show there's enough, activity to support employees and be an operating business. Also similar to real estate, both for real estate and for equity trading, these are really highly regulated industries. And often you do need separate licenses. So for example, if you're doing a construction company, you need to think about, do I need a general contractor's license? If you're doing a brokerage, do you need a broker's license? Are you able to get those things before you apply for the E2 visa? Or if not, are you able to create perhaps for partnerships with people working in those industries in the US so that you can explain that your company will have the ability to operate while you wait and go through the licensing process. So all important considerations with these types of applications, and good to just go into the interviews knowing that very likely that you'll receive kind of additional scrutiny and additional questioning. All right, let's talk about some reasons for E-2 denials. So one is low investment amounts. So, as Michaela described earlier, there's lots of strategies you can take when you have a low investment amount, but there are some investment amounts that are just too low. And as well, depending on the type of company you're opening, the investment amount, a low investment amount that might work for a service-based business like a consultancy or a law firm really isn't going to work if you have kind of a very like manufacturing company or a company that requires a lot of startup costs to get to the point of being operational. So another reason could be the nature of the business. So as we just discussed, there are some industries that have additional scrutiny placed on them. So it may be the case that, based on the type of business that you're doing, if you are, flipping a couple homes or you're in real estate, and they don't feel that it's really an active enough business, that could be an issue. Another is filing location and venue. So when you're going into an application with a lower investment amount, it's very important to talk with your attorney about where you will file. Although the law is the same across the board, different consulates, will have different, like criteria for what they consider to be substantial. So some consulates that may be very used to seeing large multinational companies, for them seeing an investment amount from a small business owner of $60,000, they may just deny that, out of hand because what they're used to seeing is investments of hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. As well, consular officers do rotate throughout the years. So there are times when certain posts may be more or less friendly to E-2 visas or lower or higher investment amounts, depending on who's in charge at the consulate. So it is an important thing to talk with your attorney and understand what are the current trends at the various consulates or with USCIS where you could apply and see, what might work best for you. So the next two reasons for denial are kind of related. So, for example, let's say you've run a business in your home country for 10 years and you've never hired any employees. That may lead to a denial based on marginality, where they may feel that this business is not going to create jobs for more than just the investor, because looking at the track record, this person's run a similar business and never did create jobs. So that speaks to the second bullet point here. You can be denied if there is a concern over whether or not you will actually create jobs. If you're doing a startup, then you will submit a comprehensive 5-year business plan, showing your hiring plans. Particularly for consultancies, I think there's often a fear that the consultant is going to come in and just operate as a solo consultant. So it can be very helpful in those cases to hire someone before you file. It's not a requirement to have employees before you file the E-2 case, but it definitely strengthens the application a lot. And particularly if you're in one of those situations where perhaps you run a similar business and never hired anyone, it may be, strategically wise to hire before you go to the interview, just to address that concern, right away. Other reasons, issues with an adjudicating officer. So consular officers are human beings. They're getting through many, many, many visa applications a day, often, needing to do so very quickly. There can be times when an officer also is just less familiar with the law, perhaps takes a position that seems, incorrect. So we always recommend to our clients, try to be as polite as possible, try to, fact find, ask if they can provide you with more context for what they were unhappy with, because you can always, try to adjust the application and apply again. In the final, sometimes people will apply and perhaps, they didn't meet the requirements at the time of filing. So for example, if you apply and you don't own 50% of the E-2 company, or we had a client who applied and, had put $98,000 into a business bank account and spent $2,000, it just doesn't meet the requirements. So if that's the case, then ultimately they'll deny the case, but you do have the ability to reapply. All right, let's talk about some E-2 visa adjudication trends and hot topics. So COVID and the E-2 visa. So thankfully, this is much, much less of a hot topic than it used to be. However, there are still some ongoing impacts in the sense that consulates were all allowed to kind of reopen, based on, what the consular staff was able to accomplish. It often had a lot to do with kind of staffing and country conditions as well. So there are still some delays that are, directly linked to the pandemic. Some consulates have very, very long wait times. Bogota just recently started processing E-2 visa applications again at all. Many consulates are, more are stricter now about only allowing citizens of their country to apply and won't allow third country nationals to apply as they try to kind of work through the backlog. There are consulates that have returned to business as usual. For example, Toronto, they're processing cases, around the exact same timing that they did pre-pandemic, but it's definitely not the case, across the board. So timelines are, still lengthened. An option that you could consider is, extending your status within the United States or changing your status if you have not had E-2 status yet. So when we look at, filings with USCIS versus filings with the consulate, there's some important things to consider. So one is with USCIS, you're not getting a visa stamp in your passport. You're getting a 2-year approval notice that allows you to stay in the US and run the business. But once you depart, once you leave the United States, you will not be allowed back in based on that approval notice. You would actually need to go to a consulate and submit a brand new E-2 visa application. It's kind of different than other visas. For example, with an H-1B or an L, you may get an approval, and when you go to the consulate, it's almost like a rubber stamp. They're not re-adjudicating the merits of the petition. But for an E-2, that's different. For an E-2 application, they will be looking at the merits of the application. They are not required to rely on the USCIS approval at all. So if you're someone who needs to travel internationally a lot, it's probably a better idea to go to the consulate and get that visa stamp. Another thing to consider with USCIS is that they are much friendlier to low investment amounts right now. It needs to make sense in light of the type of business you're starting. So this wouldn't work for all businesses, but for kind of service-based businesses, much lower investment amounts can sometimes be successful. However, they do have a very strict requirement for the source and trail of funds. So they'll allow the lower investment amount, but you do need to demonstrate, exactly where the money came from, doing like a dollar for dollar accounting, no matter how far back, it goes. With the consulate, the benefit is that you can get a visa stamp in your passport that allows for, international travel. The amount of time you'll get in your visa, as Michaela mentioned, depends on kind of which country you come from. Each country has what we call a reciprocity schedule with the United States. So there's many places where they'll grant a 5-year E-2 visa, like in Canada or the UK. And then there's other places like Bangladesh, where you're going to get a 3-month visa stamp. So that's something important to discuss with your attorney. Consulates also often take a more high level view of the source and trail of funds. So you do still need to provide documentation for this. And some consulates are more, stringent than others, but they're definitely overall much less, focused on this than USCIS is. However, most consulates will require a higher investment amount. So there's pros and cons to each. All right, so let's talk about some issues and complex areas that come up with E-2s. So very common question, do I have to hire employees before I apply? The answer is no, you don't. There are some consulates that we're aware of that kind of take a different position than that, but the vast majority of consulates, acknowledge that no hiring is required before you file, but it can strengthen your case. So complicated source and trail of funds. This is always something to bring up to your attorney at the beginning, particularly for USCIS filings. As I mentioned, they want to see that dollar for dollar accounting of exactly where the money, came from. So people, will often ask, can I get a loan? And the answer is yes, you can get a loan, but it has to be secured by your personal property or unsecured. It cannot be secured on the assets of the E-2 business. So this comes up sometimes when people are purchasing a business and they want to use seller financing. Very often in those circumstances of seller financing, the security for that is the E-2 business. So that is not permitted. So you would want to avoid that or try to get, the financing to be based on your personal assets and not on the E-2 business. Gifts can also be the source of funds for the E-2. The key there is that you cannot just provide a gift letter. You also have to show where the gift giver got the money. So for example, if it's your parent and they sold a property, you would need to show the purchase sale agreement, proof of your parent receiving that money, and then proof of your parent sending that money to you. So I see someone's raised their hand a couple of times. So we are almost to the end of the presentation and we'll answer questions at that time. So if you have questions, please go ahead and send them, through the Q&A or chat box. For the, another thing to consider is E2 visas for two investors. People will often ask about this. So this is possible if ownership is 50-50. Things to stay away from, you wouldn't want a situation where one investor is investing $100,000 and the other is investing $5,000. That second investor, their investment may not be considered substantial. Additionally, you wouldn't want to have a situation where one investor gifts the other investor all of those funds. They may not feel that it's the second investor's personal funds if they're coming from, the other investor who is also putting their money into the company. Another thing to consider are substantive changes to your E2 business after filing. So, sometimes people will get the E2 visa and maybe it's granted for 5 years. And then during that 5 years, something goes wrong with the business or they want to change, the direction of the business. So it is important to remember that even though the visa is issued for 5 years, if the underlying eligibility changes, the visa will not be valid anymore. So if you own 50% of the business and then you sold 25% of it, and you now no longer own 50% and you no longer have operational control, you're not maintaining your status anymore. So changes in ownership, you always want to kind of look at carefully and discuss with your attorney before those happen. Similarly, changes to the type of business that are kind of substantive, substantial changes. So let's say you were running a wedding photography business and now you want to close that down and start a restaurant. So those things are just completely different. So you would need to get, even if you're doing it under the same LLC, you would need to go back to the consulate or to USCIS and get a new approval before you could start, that new business line. And then finally, family business purchases. So people do ask this often, can I purchase, a business from a family member? And the answer is yes, you can, but it's the type of case that's going to receive more scrutiny. So for example, you would want to make sure that you had some type of objective valuation, or perhaps, a letter from a CPA explaining why the purchase price is actually the fair market value of the business based on, the financial history of the business. So if it's a very successful business with, high profits and revenues and assets, and the person's willing to sell it to you for, $20,000, and it's your brother, that's not going to look very good to the consulate. You do need to do a little bit more to show this is a legitimate business transaction. And even though it's not arm's length, the amount that I'm paying is a substantial amount. All right, so I think we've reached the end, and there's a couple questions that have come in. So let's see. Michaela, do you want to take the first one?
Let me see. I'm trying to buy a gas station in Oregon with a partner and 51% of partnership, and the deal is already in escrow with the earnest money. Is it a good idea to acquire E2, and when should I move with an application, as I'm Canadian and lies in West Coast? Definitely, like if you own 50, if you are going to own 51% in this business, that's fine. But generally, you would want to send the escrow agreement and the purchase sale agreement to an immigration attorney, like before you sign them. In this case, it looks that, probably some sort of deposit was already transferred. But I would recommend to kind of, reaching out to an immigration attorney, perhaps, before the transaction is finalized, just in case, like anything needs to be updated in the, in the agreement so it meets the E2 visa requirements.
Perfect. All right. So as the next one, I want to open a cake shop in Orlando with an investment of 70,000 and do a change of status. Will this be a good business? I'll hire an employee and plan to open more branches. So I think that generally sounds fine. I'd say my only concern is just, sometimes if you're opening an actual tangible, shop, that can, potentially have higher costs. So as long as kind of the 70,000 is covering everything that's needed to get the company to the point of being operational, I think that could potentially work. You do want to, if you are doing a change of status, ideally you want to be changing status from B1, not from B2. The B1 is the business visitor status that allows you to do setup activities like, opening a bank account, incorporating, things like that. So it does sound like it's potentially, viable. Another thing to just keep in mind is you will need a very, very clear source and trail of funds if you're doing a USCIS filing. I'm a Canadian trying to set up my business in New York. How do I go about opening a bank account? The bank wants to see proof of residence. So ultimately, like you will need to like most banks, what they require is the articles of organization or incorporation, the shareholder agreement or operating agreement, and the tax ID. Some banks do have additional requirements, including residency. You would ultimately need to call around, and we recommend calling the exact branch where you plan to visit to make sure that you would have all the documents that are needed to open up a business bank account in the US. So not all banks require residency, for a business bank account, but that would be something where it's bank specific, and you would need to just call around and find one that would accommodate. All right. So I think we have reached the end of our time. So I think we will close here. Thank you so much, Michaela, for sharing your knowledge. I hope this was helpful. Thank you, everyone, for your great questions. Have a nice day.
Thank you. Bye.